Welcome, LA Progressive friends and family. This is Sharon Kyle here from the LA Progressive, joined by Mark Naison, an old friend, a contributor to the LA Progressive, a fellow New Yorker. And I sent an email to Mark asking him if he would agree to be interviewed, especially in light of a lot of the actions that Trump and well, Vice President Trump and President Musk have been taking. And so Mark replied that, well, he wasn't so sure that he'd have a lot to say because he works at Fordham University and he didn't feel that, Fordham was under as much duress as the universities. And I said, absolutely, we need to hear from you. So we started talking 5 minutes ago and I hadn't pressed the record button. So Mark, tell me, how do you feel about this fight? What were you saying before? And
Well,
don't put
what
any
I
four-letter
told you,
words. No four-letter words because
no
Google.
four-letter words. Okay, no
Yeah,
BIOMF. People can look
right.
that up.
That's right.
Okay, I said, when Trump was inaugurated and starting this massive assault on so many things that we fought for, my attitude was, okay, I was made for this fight. Um, because what I felt was going on was, the kind of bullying that some of us experienced in our youth in schools and neighborhoods writ large. And I was basically fighting bullies since I was 10 years old, when my parents made me skip a grade in this very tough Brooklyn neighborhood called Pigtown, and all the other kids started picking on me because I skipped a grade and wore glasses, at which point I just beat them up. And then they invited me to play in their football team because the idea was everybody would spend their time teasing me until there was a fight or a ball game when they wanted me on their side. So ever since then, I've been fighting uphill battles. I was, very involved in the civil rights movement in high school, where my parents opposed what I was doing. And then when I got to Columbia, where I was the only athlete in the protest group, I was a college athlete. And all these, my jock friends said, what are you doing protesting? And I said, I'm doing it because the protests are right. So, and then when I got the job at Fordham, I was the first white professor hired by a Black Studies program. And people said, they're not going to let you do it. And here I am 54 years later, still teaching. So this is an uphill battle, but it's a battle we can win if we don't give anything away, if we
Absolutely.
fight for everything.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. And that's the position that the LA Progressive has taken as well. But I've always been interested. I've always been interested in white people who take on this fight for civil rights and to fight for the rights of African Americans. Can you talk a little bit about, what led you down this path in the first place?
Okay. So I, because of my experience of being picked on, I always had this visceral identification with the underdog. And I grew up in a neighborhood where there were always a few Black kids who were part of, everything we did. And then when I went to high school, I had Black teammates and friends who I went to school with. Um, and they never talked about their experience because this is the 50s and you pretended that everybody was the same. But when I started, basically seeing what was going on in the South on television with the student sit-ins and the freedom rides, and then when I read James Baldwin's book, Another Country, and I realized that something awful was happening, not just in the South, but even here to people like I had grown up with, I said, I can't turn my back on this. And then something else happened, which changed my life. So I came to college. It's probably the only thing I succeeded in at Columbia was sports in my first year. I didn't do great academically. Socially, I was a little awkward, but I was a star athlete. I was, ended up as the number one singles player in the Columbia tennis team. And Then in my sophomore year, I joined the chapter of Columbia Corps and start tutoring and organizing rent strikes and meeting, really amazing people. And something happened to me. When I was growing up, I assumed that no one would ever like me, much less love me. But because I was really good in sports and really good in school, I would just kick everybody's butt. And I didn't need care if anybody liked me or loved me. At least that's what I told myself. I mean, I listened to Everly Brothers songs, When Will I Be Loved, which made me, maybe hope. Then when I got involved in the civil rights movement and used this energy to help others, all of a sudden people started liking me and then even loving me. And so the idea that there's a great quote I read in Richard Hofstadter's American Political Tradition from the abolitionist Wendell Phillips. None knows what it is to live unless you place your life as a sacrifice on the altar of some great cause. When I started doing that, my whole life became enriched in extraordinary ways. So this is the way I've lived. Yeah, I'm a fighter, and yeah, I'm not the most admirable person in the world sometimes because I have a temper, and I'm pretty rough. But being able to use what I have to help others in need, to help more people more vulnerable, it's been a great way to live. I'm 78 years old, and I'm nowhere near retiring, and so I love this fight. I mean, it's a lot of pressure, but the other thing about this is, my dissertation was about the history of the Communist Party and the labor movement. And so I studied how the labor movement functioned in an America where there were huge portions of it were might as well have been fascist, not just the South, where Black people not only lack the right to vote, and go to the same schools, they were under a reign of terror. They couldn't organize publicly. But the same was also true in large sections of the rest of the country in company towns, where the companies controlled the police, where they had spies. So to organize, people had to do so covertly. So the minute Trump was elected, I said, folks, here's what you got to do. Get together with a few trusted friends and form covert groups to help the most vulnerable people around you. And that's what I've been doing largely around immigration issues. I formed groups called icebreakers. These are small groups of trusted individuals who keep track of deportations, trying to help people under duress with legal assistance, with food, directing people to protests. So it's like, I moved into action day one when I saw we were heading. But I also felt people needed cheerleading. My wife says to me, Mark, you're not a leader, you're a cheerleader. You're telling people they're not going to lose. Don't give up before the fight. You're not going to lose, this if you fight back. So that's, this is what I've been doing. I've been trying both to organize in ways I can, but also to cheer people up and tell them, don't give anything away. A lot of what they're doing is trying to scare you into giving up. Trump issues an executive order. You don't have to obey it. He banned congestive pricing. Guess what? We still have congestive pricing. He says you can't, teach DEI and CRT. I have DEI on my screensaver and my shirt says, I love CRT. Is he stopping me from doing anything I'm doing? No. So I'm not saying there aren't real dangers, but when those come, face them, don't imagine them.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
that's been how I've been operating.
So tell us,
And
you said that Fordham University no longer has DEI, it has DEO. So what
Right.
led to that? And what led to
Okay.
that? And what does the
We
difference mean?
have a very smart college president who has a background as a law professor and somebody who was a lifetime civil rights supporter, but she's also very astute. You know, Fordham has a lot of conservatives in its board of trustees. She saw what happened to the college presidents at, Columbia, Penn, Harvard. So she figured out a way to, have us work in ways that keep our values intact without inviting them to come after us. So I thought that was a pretty clever move, actually. Um, but I think, look, being a college president is a really hard job right now. In talking to her, I'd say I'd rather be in Rikers Island than have your job.
Wow.
Because everybody's watching you and they're ready to pull you before a congressional committee. Nobody's calling me before a congressional committee. I'm virtually inviting people to make an example of me.
But
Nobody
she's
is.
but she doesn't seem to be opposed to you inviting people. Your speech has in no way been constricted.
Nobody in their right mind would try to constrict my speech. I have an army of former students and community supporters, which I've accumulated over 50 years. I am part of the reason, look, I call myself Dr. Privilege. I'm 78 years old. I'm a full professor. I have such a good pension that I could retire without a loss of salary. I probably make more retired. I have rich children. And besides, everybody's scared of me. So I might as well make myself a target to take attention away from more vulnerable people.
That is just so, I love that. You understand your privilege and you understand that you're perfectly situated to take a stand. All too often, people that are in like situations like yours, they tend to try to stay under the radar.
Okay, but look, when I was invited to join a Black Studies program, and which became a department, I realized that, I had a role, and part of it was to protect my Black colleagues. Let's say the university did something destructive to our department. If my colleagues got really angry, they'd be written off as angry Black people. As a white person, I could be angrier than they are, so they could be, in other words, I could be the bad cop. So my Black colleagues would be the good cop.
Absolutely. I understand that.
And my Black friends would say, look, Mark, if you were Black, you would have been dead a long time ago. And I know that. So I can walk point for
Wow.
the struggle.
But the fact that
Because,
you know that, you
I'm
know that.
protected by privilege. Did I
What?
not know that? I
You
mean,
did you
I live
always
this every damn day.
you live it, but there are people who live it and are still oblivious to their privilege. Do you think it's possible that their obliviousness is intentional?
I'm sure it is because a lot of people are conflict aversive, and I am conflict inviting.
Mm.
In other words, I still play competitive tennis because I love conflict. I'm not saying this is a good thing. It's probably not a good thing, but this is who I am. This is how I grew up. And so I might as well use this. In other words, I'm using things which are either ambivalent and maybe even bad for good. I like to say I was forged in the fires of toxic masculinity
Mm.
on the streets of Brooklyn. You grew up in the Bronx.
That's right.
And you were surrounded by guys who were like the guys who were bullying me.
I
And
sure
most of
was.
the bullies ended up retreating to their apartments. people like Lin-Manuel Miranda, who wrote songs about what it was like for him to be bullied and not fight back. Well, I was the kid who fought back
Yeah.
and won. So I was, but I never thought it was right what happened to me. And I also knew, and I try to defend other kids who were bullied. Well, so let me give you an example of this. Okay. I'm a, I entered Wingate High School in 1959 as a 13-year-old college sophomore in a very tough multiracial high school. And this is before I grew. So I was 5'5", had a crew cut and glasses, and I'm in this gym class, and these 6 black kids are picking on me. And I don't give an inch. And then when they try to humiliate me, I just say, and then they knock me out cold. So I'm ready. I go up to my homeroom, throw up, and I'm ready to go back there the next day because my attitude is I don't back down to anybody. So my parents make me transfer to another high school. And I'm put in this homeroom class, and I see these 2 Irish kids torturing this nerdy looking Jewish kid. So when the teacher leaves the room, I go beat the 2 of them up.
Yeah.
I even had to do this at a summer camp I went to when I was 13, where they put me in a bunk with older kids. And there were these 3 kids who were torturing a kid with glasses who couldn't fight, And they were doing things like urinating on him in the middle of the night, dumping his bed. And I said, this has to stop. And they said, you're going to make us. So I fought them and I lost, but it stopped. So this is but I can't expect other people to do this.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a weird background. Also, I came from a family. One side were intellectuals. The other side, my grandfather was a strong-arm man for the unions, and I had 2 second cousins who were hitmen in Murder Incorporated.
Thanks.
So, it's an unusual biography, but I try to use this for good.
And you have. I mean, at Columbia, at Fordham, you have really shaped the African American Studies program. So, talk about that. 50 years of being a professor of African American Studies and History, and the founder and director of the Bronx African American History Project. Talk a little bit about both of those. What's happening with the Bronx? Go ahead.
Well, okay. Look, I'm invited. I found out about the job at Fordham in the basketball court. There's this, I sort of half adopt kids. So there was this like teenager from Inwood, from a white working class family who was attracted to the movement, but he came from this very conservative background. He was a great basketball player. And so I helped him, separate from his families and be able to connect to the movement and also his black teammates. So I'm playing basketball with him in Riverside Park. And he says, Mark, my black studies teacher at Fordham said there's an opening in his department in the program, which had been created as a result of a student sit-in. So I write a letter that says, first of all, I am white. And if that disqualifies me, I understand perfectly. But if not, and I'll do X, Y, and Z. So to my shock, they call me in for an interview and ask me, what do you want to teach? And I make up 3 courses on the spot: history of American racism, history of black protest, African Americans and the American labor movement. And then to my utter astonishment, they offered me the job. Now, I had gotten 3 offers from community colleges because my fellowship had run out, and I had. So do I want to be with crew-cut whites teaching Western Civ and American history, or do I want to go into a newly founded Black Studies program teaching what I want, knowing that half the people don't think I should be there? But parenthetically, this is 1970. At this point, I'm basically living in a black family because my girlfriend was black. I had been kicked out of my family, adopted by her family. So this was my world, for better or worse. And so I said, let me do the Fordham job. And the first day I'm on campus, um, I go into the gym and start like scrimmaging with the players in the Fordham basketball team because I knew I needed a constituency. And I had one thing going for me. I wasn't like a great basketball player, but I could really jump. I was a white guy who could play over the almost over the rim at just under 6 feet tall. So they're saying, who's that guy? And I also knew enough to always pass to better players. So I just did the dirty work, ran and jumped. So I made friends with them. And then when I started teaching, I made friends with my students. And there was a small group of Black students who thought I shouldn't be there, and they try to intimidate me. So they come to the office and stare at me, and I just stare back at me. Well, welcome to my life. You think you're going to. And then there were also rumors that I had been a terrorist and in the Weather Underground. And then just to, add to it, I got a bodyguard who was a ex-Green Beret drug dealer and carried a butcher knife in my attaché case. So those guys left, and then I loved my colleagues, I loved my students, and we had a mission of making the experience of people of African descent central to every discipline taught at Fordham. And we were not just trying to influence that with what we taught, but would hopefully influence in other departments. And over the years, it worked.
Wow.
So I'm there 30 years and I'm having a ball. I mean, look, I'm a little bit of an exhibitionist and an entertainer. You know, Part of this came from sports. I love when people watch me play sports, you know. Like if you grow up that way, there were, I'm sure, guys like that in your neighborhood, the ball players,
Oh,
you know,
yes.
and also, especially, they like to have the girls watch them.
Yes.
So I wasn't the best looking guy in the world, but being a ball player definitely helped my social life. So, so here I am, and I'm having the greatest time. And um, some this is like, I guess it's the fall of 2002. I'm at a book party, and the head archivist of the Bronx County Historical Society comes up to me and says, Mark, we're getting all these requests for information about African American history in the Bronx, and we don't have anything. Do you think you and your colleagues could help us, find some information? We're getting this from schools, from churches, civil rights groups. So I was at a point in my life where both of my kids were on the verge of graduating from college, and both of them were athletes. So I had been following all of their games. And I just finished the book tour with this book, White Boy, a Memoir. So I actually had all this time. I said, sure, let me look into it. So I did some research, found there were over 500,000 people of African descent in the Bronx, and there was nothing written about them. There weren't books, there weren't articles. When the Schomburg Center did something called The Black New Yorkers, there was a book of 424 pages, 3 pages in the Bronx. It was all Bed-Stuy and Harlem. So I
Wow.
said, wow, there's something here that needs investigation. But when you have an important subject, but you don't have any, what do? You do oral histories. You get people to tell their stories, so you find out what are the important institutions? What are the important neighborhoods? What are the important themes? And my motto for this, believe it or not, was the WPA project that interviewed 2,000 formerly
Yes.
enslaved people in the 1930s, which were neglected for like 20 years and then became the major source in African American history once Black studies became established. So I said, okay, how am I going to start? I had a student when I first started teaching named Vicky Archibald. She was my age, 24, and her brother was Nate Tiny Archibald, the greatest, basketball player ever to come out of the Bronx. I knew she had grown up in the Patterson houses, so she was now a social worker, in Nassau County. I invited her to do an oral history. She said, sure. She spoke for 3 hours about
Wow.
how the Patterson houses in her youth was this amazing place to grow up in. It defied every stereotype about public housing and also about Black experiences in the Bronx. It was so good, I ended up having it published as an article in the Bronx County Historical Society Review. That's how good this interview was. And then I said, okay, I'm going to wait a while before interviewing. And her friends start calling me. When are you going to interview us? We've been trying to tell our story for 30 years. So I started, all these people from the Patterson houses contacted me asking to be interviewed. Social workers, lawyers, teachers, professors, ex-pro athletes. And I said to Fordham, we're on the verge of doing something remarkable here, but I need funds to hire student assistants to help transcribe these interviews. And here's the argument that got them. I said, Columbia and NYU dropped the ball there because their professors were scared to go to the Bronx. I'm not. So we're going to get the jump on Columbia and NYU. And so they gave me 4 student assistants. And then what happened, so I did like 20 interviews just with people from one housing project. Then a friend of mine who's a New York Times reporter contacts me and asks if she can go along while I go down to the Patterson houses with one of the people I've interviewed, who is an college All-American basketball player. And so the interview in the car, I'm playing loud music, as I always do. We go to the Patterson houses and start shooting baskets, and then we eat at a deli where he used to eat. And she wrote an article about this strange professor doing the. Now people all over the Bronx are contacting me. How dare you write about this subject without us? And it's been going on ever since, and it's still taking off. Now we are focusing on the growth of Co-op City as perhaps the major center of Black culture, political activism, and community building in the Bronx, which no one knows about. So we have people there telling their stories.
Well, I have family that still lives there. And, I'm from
okay,
Edenwald.
well, we're going to, we have to interview you about Edenwald. Okay. I have you grew up in Edenwald?
Yes.
Okay, so you know about bullying.
Oh, yes, I do.
Edenwald, just for those, is the best project in the North Bronx, if not
Yes.
in the entire Bronx. If you grew up in Edenwald, you get mad respect from anybody who knows the Bronx, because that place was and is legendary.
Of course, I didn't know it was legendary when I lived there. I didn't realize that it was different until I left the projects, until I moved to California. So even until I married my husband, you talk about a lot of fighting. Well, fights were sort of every day, several fights. So I thought that that's how most people, that's how their childhood was. Little did I know, no, that's absolutely not normal.
No, it's not normal. I mean, it may be normal for certain New York neighborhoods, Pigtown and Edenwald. So,
Yeah.
Pigtown was legendary in Brooklyn, Edenwald was, legendary in the Bronx. But, the thing about it is I love hearing people telling their stories. And what I try to do is have them trust me enough to tell them that by saying, this is about you, not about me. I'm not here to write a book. I'm here to collect stories so that in 30 years, people will be able to write better books. Again, using the model of the WPA narratives. The people who did them didn't write books. The books were written 30 years later.
Well, this is a wonderful thing. This is a wonderful thing that Fordham is doing, because in the effort to ban books, to get rid of DEI, to get rid of anything having to do with the racialized populations of the United States, what you're doing is holding on to histories that are so essential to the making of this country.
Well, let me just tell you something else about it. All of our interviews are on a digital archive that anybody can access them from all over around the world. In 5 years, we've had over 60,000 views from over 120 countries. People all over the world are accessing our archive.
Well, I'm going to have
Um,
to put a link. So I don't know if you know it off the top of your head. I'll search for it and I'll put a link in at the bottom of this interview, a link to your archives, unless you know the URL off the
I
top
mean,
of
the problem is I am so backward that if you want, I may have to do it at the end of the show because I don't I let me try something and I can put it in chat.
Sure.
Okay, let me find it and
But you don't have to do it right now because we don't need
oh,
this part filmed.
oh, I can do it now. It take me a second. This will take me 1 second. I'm doing it now.
Yeah, this is a powerful way to fight against the dumbing down, really, the dumbing down of America. Trump
Yeah,
once said he loves uneducated people. Well, there's a
yeah,
reason
this
that,
is it. This is the link to the archive. It contains like 350 interviews and like 35 essays.
okay,
Um, and they're ongoing. We keep doing interviews. We're going to interview you about your experiences growing up in Edenwald.
absolutely.
One other thing that gives an example. Like I've been working very closely with people in the Co-op City NAACP. Today, I get an invitation to testify at a hearing of a New York State Commission on Reparations and Remedies at Co-op City on April 10th.
April 10th. Okay. All right. I got to let
So,
my, because I have family that lives there right now.
okay, I will get you the information. But here, we're in New York State. We're not backing off. We have a commission on reparations and remedies.
Fabulous.
And New York City is doubling down on teaching of Black history in its public schools, of teaching about LGBTQ people. Nobody in New York is giving an inch to Trump. Nobody. Now, what the people most vulnerable are the people living in red states where the legislatures are coming after the public schools
I
along
see.
with Trump. But in New York or California, the public schools can't be touched because they're mostly locally funded.
Right.
The federal funding, I mean, it could hurt, but not, but people won't give in. But in places like Florida, it's terrible to teach because the state legislature, even before Trump did this, were, suppressing teaching about certain subjects. So
So,
the
Mark, so
place where the,
I've
yeah,
maintained that studying African American history is important for everyone, whether or not
yeah,
you are a member of the African American community. Because when you try to understand what bullies do, what exploitation looks like, it's important for you to be able to identify it because ultimately it can and most likely will hurt everybody.
yeah. Well, it's absolutely true. Like, when the South between 1890 and 1912 passed laws restricting Black voting, they also restricted voting opportunities for many poor whites.
Yes.
And one of the results were that the South as a whole was a region where they had much lower wages for everyone. And, so here you had a textile industry where only whites were hired as machine operators, but they still had 12-hour days and, brutal working conditions. The problem is that white supremacists have gotten over the argument that the psychological benefit of punishing Black people is worth losing ground economically. And that's very much part of the Trump appeal. There's even a book written called Dying of Whiteness, which
Yes.
was written a few years ago about how states are passing these laws which are crippling the life expectancy of their predominantly white populations because the legislation is billed as punishing those people,
Yeah.
mainly Black people and immigrants.
Yeah.
So we're going to see over the next year, as inflation skyrockets, as more and more people are fired, whether the white and Latino people who, so mostly Latino men who voted for Trump, are going to start turning on him as they see their conditions, their lives, become harder and more insecure. Um, History is not necessarily comforting on that score. Though in the
Mhm.
Great Depression, amazing things happened. And I have this one story I want to tell, and I do tell people about, okay, 1919 was one of the worst racial massacres in U.S. history in rural Arkansas. It's called the Elaine Massacre. It took place when black soldiers coming back from the war, who are, back at working as tenant farmers and sharecroppers, decided they were being cheated by their plantation owners and decided they would market their own crops. When the sheriff and vigilante groups came to break up their meeting, there was a gunfight and several, whites were killed, at which point the local whites went on a rampage and killed several hundred black people in that area of rural Arkansas. So segue, I guess, 14 years later, um, the New Deal has passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which is paying farmers not to plant crops. Well, the planters in eastern Arkansas are taking this money and they're evicting they're not giving any of the money to the tenant farmers and sharecroppers who are basically now starving. And these are the whites as well as the blacks. So you have white people who are in the Klan reaching out to black people, some of who had been the Garvey movement. How can we fight back together? And they founded an organization called the Southern Tenant Farmers Union in 1934, in the same place where there had been a racial massacre 14 years before. It's a story
I
almost nobody knows.
No, I'd never heard of that story. I collect those stories. So can you repeat the name of the organization that was formed that was
The
comprised?
Southern, I wrote my master's thesis about it, the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. And the Elaine Massacre of 1919 and the Southern Tenant Farmers Union founded in 1934.
And this is exactly the kind of solidarity that the people at the top don't want. They want to keep us separated.
Okay, let me tell you another story since you seem to like stories. Okay,
I do.
so I'm writing my master's essay in the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, and I head down to the University of North Carolina, where in the Southern Historical Collection, they have all the papers of this union. And who shows up but one of the leaders of the union named H.L. Mitchell, who was one of the leaders. If you look him up, H.L. Mitchell, Southern Tenant Farmer, it comes up. So I'm eating dinner with him. And of course, this is a rare privilege. Here's the historian meeting with the person you're studying. And he says, Mark, I got a proposition for you. I have to drive down to New Orleans, and I'm over 70, and that's a big drive for me. If you drive 2/3 of the way down there, I will drop you off at the house of Reverend Claude Williams, who is this amazing Spitfire minister who used the Bible to organize blacks and whites together. And it was pistol whipped, tarred and feathered, and driven, but he was a major leader of the organization too. But his specialty was using the Bible, the common biblical heritage of Southern blacks and white. So I said, sure. So he drops me off at Claude Williams' house. And we spend, 5 hours talking, and he makes a proposition. Listen, I need somebody. I have a whole shed full of personal papers. If you'll come down to the summer to organize my personal papers, I'll give you all the information you want. So I got a grant to do that. And this guy was a symbol of this. He not only did this in rural Arkansas. He did it in Memphis with black and white riverboat workers, in Detroit with auto workers, back down in Alabama with the mine, mill, and smelters workers union until in the McCarthy era they shut him down and actually had him removed from the Presbyterian ministry. And he's this tough old guy in his 70s, and we just hit it off perfectly, sitting there drinking bourbons and beer. And this is from like 1970 to 1974. I spent every summer down there with this hero. And here's what's fascinating. Yeah.
Go ahead. And then I have a question, because you talked about this organization starting in Arkansas, but yet you're sitting down and talking to him in North Carolina. So I want you to talk about how North Carolina got to be a part of this story.
Okay, North Carolina got involved because the university collected papers from important organizations. The Southern Historical Collection is the major archive on the labor movement in the South. For any labor organization in the South was at the University of North Carolina, which had a very liberal president in the 1940s and 50s named Frank Graham. And so this Union archive, all the papers were there. So, but let me tell you the story about Claude Williams okay. He lives in this rural area called Fungo Hollow, Alabama, up in the hills. And after all, he's, been exiled from, the church, the Union. The Ku Klux Klan burns crosses in his lawn, shoots his dog, but his neighbors don't let him kill him. They protect him because he brought food and all this stuff from his northern supporters to give to the poorer white people in his area. So they kept the Klan from killing him.
Amazing.
And he's one of my heroes in my life. He's like an alternate grandfather to me. And of course, I could tell him all the stories of the things that I did and went through in the late 60s, early 70s, which, some of which were pretty rough. But we have this history.
And this is the history that they're attempting to suppress.
They can't do it. There are too many of us. And the world is our audience. Never forget, the world is on our side in fighting Trumpism. Not necessarily agreeing with every policy that America has done before Trump, but on this issue, we have a lot of support around the world, especially in the teaching of histories of people who have been marginalized, excluded, and silenced.
Yes. Well, Mark, we are at our point where we need to end this discussion, but I want to pick it up again, and I want to talk more about I want you to share more about these stories. So many people need to hear these stories. The LA Progressive audience would just eat this up.
Okay, I have a great story for you about how the most militant union in New York City was organized, but I won't tell. I'll save it for the next time.
Sounds great. Thank you for sticking around. If you like the LA Progressive content and the discussions we have here, please consider clicking the subscribe button below, and also give us a thumbs up. That helps to grow our audience by feeding the algorithm, which helps to get this content in front of more eyes. Thanks for stopping by. We really appreciate your support.